Welcome to Sports Beat KC, a sports podcast presented by the Kansas City Star. I'm Blair Kerkhoff. We got some sad news Monday morning with the passing of Gunther Cunningham, former Chiefs head coach, longtime assistant coach, defensive coordinator. He was a colorful figure in Kansas City, fondly remembered by those who played for him and knew him well. Star columnist Sam Mellinger stopped by, and he and I chatted about Gunther's couple years as a head coach and his tenure in Kansas City. Sam, it was a sad day for Chiefs fans and followers of this team for a long time. Gunther Cunningham passed away, and it happened over the weekend. He was the Chiefs head coach in 1999 and 2000. He was the defensive coordinator for the 4 years prior to that, and he returned as a defensive coordinator in 2004 for Dick Vermeil. You were not at the Star, I don't believe. You would have been pre Kansas City Star time for you, but you were following the Chiefs then. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you what you remembered most about the Gunther Cunningham. First of all, the defenses that he coordinated from in the mid to late 90s, and then what do you remember about his head coaching tenure?
I think of Gunther Cunningham a little bit like a comic book character. The name, the voice, you remember just like deep, gravelly, like I wanted that voice, you know?
Absolutely.
When I was like, God, I wanted that voice. I was reading your story. I don't know if did you get Carl on the phone?
Yeah, I talked to Carl Peterson, the GM who hired him and fired him and rehired him.
Yeah, he was intensity personified, a fully committed coach and a brilliant defensive coordinator. That was Carl's quote that you got. And that's really well said. Do you remember he got in not in like physical fight, but like an argument with fans in a game?
Yes.
They were like, because he was coaching from the booth, and somebody like turned around and said something to him, and Gunther's like screaming right back. Like that to me is Gunther. I mean, just so intense. It like just sort of you have this idea of like an old school football coach. That's Gunther.
He was totally old school.
Yeah.
Totally old school guy. And when he was coaching the defense, when he was the coordinator from 95 to 99, his teams averaged in scoring defense 16.4 points. Yeah. Now, having witnessed this past season with Kansas City Chiefs football, to think about a defense that surrendered an average of fewer than 17 points a game must have been a pretty salty bunch.
Yeah, there were times this past season the Chiefs would have done well to 16.4 points per half. That would have been an upgrade in some games. But I mean, a different time in the NFL, right? Obviously, like it was easy, not easier, but it was just playing defense was different back then. But even by that standard, and look, like the players are the ones that do it, right? But like Gunther, I think brought sort of just a nasty, unapologetic, hyper aggressive, knock the quarterback out, kind of personality.
Yeah,
and I think it was a good fit for those players.
Absolutely. And when you talk about a throwback or an old school guy, that's not the kind of defense we see played much, if
right.
at all. I mean, some of it's been legislated out of the NFL. The type of hitting that was kind of glorified with Gunther. Look, he was the defensive coordinator when Derek Thomas was probably at the height of his powers at 95, 96, 97. Neil Smith was still with the Chiefs for a year or two, I think, when Gunther was the coordinator. Guys like Dan Saliamua, James Hasty, Dale Carter, Donnie Edwards, the linebacker. Carl Peterson told me, and he's absolutely right, he turned defensive players into Pro Bowl defensive players.
Yeah, kind of made them stars. And maybe that's not, look, the players, I want to separate this a little bit because the players are the one that they do the work and they're the ones that deserve it. But it was certainly like during those years, the biggest stars almost without exception, with the exception being Joe Montana, when he played a couple seasons that I still say nobody outside Kansas City remembers that Joe Montana was here. But the defensive players, they were the guys. They were the big guys in town. They were the big guys in the league. And Gunther was, here's another thing about Gunther is some of these things that we've been talking about, not the name and not, he was born in Germany to an American serviceman, and I think his mom was German. and
English wasn't his native tongue. He learned English.
Some of these things that we've said of being, super intense and very old school and aggressive and knock the quarterback out kind of stuff, you could say about a guy like Buddy Ryan, right? Like that those adjectives would fit. But one difference with Gunther, he never wanted to be a star. Some of that was thrust upon him again because of some of the superficial stuff. But I think Gunther was just a football coach, man. And I mean this very much in a complimentary way. He didn't need a lot of attention or a lot of, I'm the defensive coordinator. It seemed like he was comfortable with the focus being on those guys doing it. I think that's a compliment.
I think that helps explain why he did not ultimately succeed as a head coach.
Could be.
Yeah. He was more comfortable and just felt more at his job coordinating a bunch of guys, and he did overseeing being the CEO of a football team, which is what's required of a head coach. Yeah. Even then, that was the case. I asked Carl about, Carl was the one who decided when Marty resigned after the 98 season, why he decided to elevate Gunther, and he just thought that the Chiefs were that close to getting back to consistent playoff level football and didn't want to be disruptive, didn't want to start over really with a new coach. And so Gunther was elevated, and that first season, 1999, the Chiefs are 9-6 going into their regular season finale against the Raiders, and all they have to do, it's win an NFL game, which is never easy to do, but they have to beat the Raiders at Arrowhead Stadium in Week 17 to qualify for the playoffs, and the Chiefs jump out to a 17-0 lead. And you think this is happening. It's going to happen. Gunther's going to get the Chiefs to the playoffs. They end up losing that game 41-38 in overtime. And overtime starts because the Chiefs had picked up a kicker that week, a guy named Baker, who in freezing weather decided to kick barefooted, and he kicked the overtime kickoff out of bounds. So the Raiders started on the 40 and just had to go like 30 yards for the game-winning field goal. And so Chiefs lose the game. They don't make the playoffs. Gunther does finish 9-7 that year, but I just wondered how different Chiefs football, Gunther's career would have been if that had been a 10-6 playoff team and not a 9-7 non-playoff team.
If Baker would have worn a shoe.
If he just laced him up that day.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't end well, right? Like as most things with the Chiefs have done over the years, it did not end well. I mean, the anecdote that I'll never forget is, of Gunther. He got 2 years, right, as a head coach. So at the second year, literally on Christmas, searching the internet to see if he'd been fired or not.
Yep, that's right.
Had.
That did happen. I mean, he found out.
What a brutal. I mean, but that's the way stuff goes in the NFL. I will say this: the fact that he got elevated, if a coordinator gets elevated to head coach of that team, the players like him.
That's another point that Carl Peterson was quick to make, that he was such a player's coach, and it was a very popular decision in with that team. Tim Grunhart told me that Tim was a center throughout the 90s, and he said on the Saturday night team meetings, the offense would be in one room and the defense would be in another, and it was separated by a divider. And Tim would always get a chair next to the defensive room because he wanted to hear what Gunther was telling his defensive guys, and that would get Tim all psyched up for the game. But that's what kind of motivator
that is perfect.
Gunther was.
That is perfect.
So in his second year in 2000, the Chiefs start out 5-3, and it looks like everything's okay. Along the way, they beat the St. Louis Rams that had come off the Super Bowl win. They'd scored 54 points on the Rams at Arrowhead, which at the time may still be a record for points in a home game for the Chiefs. But then they lose 5 of their final 6, and Carl Peterson decides to make the change, and that's it. Gunther goes from the Chiefs to the Tennessee Titans, where he's the defensive coordinator for 3 years. And then in a really unusual move, Dick Vermeil is the head coach now of the Chiefs, and Dick Vermeil decides to bring Gunther back, the former head coach who was fired from the Chiefs, comes back to become the Chiefs defensive coordinator, which I think is quite a compliment to Gunther and shows a kind of a level of friendship or some sort of fellowship among Dick Vermeil, Carl Peterson, and Gunther that could happen.
Yeah, I think it shows a few things that are worth noting. Is one, Dick Vermeil is kind of a boss, right? And he's not going to be worried at that point. But also kind of what we were talking about earlier about, Gunther didn't have that sort of blind and sometimes counterproductive ambition that some NFL coaches have. So he was a comfortable guy to have as your coordinator because he's going to take care of that. And that's what Dick Vermeil wanted. He didn't want to deal with with defense. He was, I got my guys.
What does that sound familiar?
Yeah,
circa
exactly.
2019.
Exactly. Like, Dick Vermeil had his half of the team that he was concerned about. I also remember, if you think about, Paul Hackett is always the first that comes to my mind, but, certain Todd Haley, a lot of coordinators that have come and gone with the Chiefs. And when they leave, they become punchlines on, in one way or another. And fans are, God, I can't believe we had that guy. Gunther was never that. When he was fired, he was still loved. Wasn't he with the Lions for a little bit, I think?
Yes, he went from the Chiefs, second tenure with the Chiefs, to the Lions for 4 years as the coordinator, and then sort of another 4 years as a scout for the Lions. So he finished his NFL career with 8 years in Detroit. Yeah, and he died in Detroit.
I think that says something. Remember it fondly after being fired, and I don't know. He was a popular guy. I was reading up. He coached. He was involved in professional football for 47 straight years.
Yes. Among those who he coached, we talked about some of the Chiefs, Derek Thomas and Neil Smith, but he also coached Leslie O'Neal with the Chargers and Howie Long with the Raiders and guys that Thomas and Long, of course, are Pro Football Hall of Famers. He spent like 13 years in the college ranks. It was George Seifert, the future 49ers coach, that gave him his big break as a college coach, and I think at Stanford. But no, Gunther, terribly interesting guy. Coached in the Canadian Football League for a year in Hamilton. He was the coach's coach. He just is. He's the coach. Yep. He should have a whistle around his neck, and I could just see him snarling at people and yelling at people, and then giving them a hug. Yeah. Afterwards, just getting in a guy's face and then hugging him. That's kind of who I remember. What I think of Gunther when I remember him. Yeah,
I keep going back to this, but I looked up the video. Of course, it's going around Twitter now of him yelling at the fan, and there's a football coach arm. And I can't describe it, but it has a certain shape and so much hair on it, and that he was pointing that finger at, and it's just from the wrist to the elbow. It's just, God, that's a coach's arm, and a coach is like such a Gunther thing to do. The kind of thing, if you did that in 2019, like people are freaking out and he's got to be fired and all this stuff. But back then, it was like, there goes Gun. There goes Gun.
Before I forget it, I'll refer to something we mentioned earlier. Chris Fickett, one of our bosses here at the Star, was suggested, and he may be right about this, that Gunther was the first coach fired in the digital era because he found out about his firing online on a website. Yeah. He had to. He did. He looked it up, and there he was.
That was a long career. If you imagine like what technology was like when Gunther started, and then he found out he was fired on the internet.
Yes.
Literally something he could not have imagined when he took his first job.
Carl Peterson also told me that he was probably overly concerned about things like that, about how he was being portrayed and what was being written about him. Yeah, sensitive about that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And something else that Carl told me I thought was interesting is that when I talked to him this morning on Monday, he didn't know about the illness, and he said that is just so typical of Gunther Cunningham not to share it with people, that he died of cancer, and Carl was pretty emotional about it. I could hear him just kind of choking up a little bit because he knew he knew Gunther, he knew his wife Renee, his two children, and Carl didn't know that Gunther, and probably if Carl didn't know, none of the Chiefs knew that Gunther was this ill. Sam, thanks for sitting around and chatting with me.
No, of course.
Links to the stories Sam and I talked about can be found in the show notes and on kansascity.com. You've been listening to Sports Beat KC, a sports podcast presented by the Kansas City Star, and I'm Blair Kerkhoff.